Romans chapter 9, starting verse 19 to chapter 10, verse 4. Hear the word of the Lord. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people, and her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. What should we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it, that is, a righteousness that is by faith, but that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, ever made a wrong assumption? Have you sat on a chair assuming it was good and have it collapse on you? Or have you leaned back expecting a wall to be there and it not be? Maybe you've taken a bite of something assuming that is good and then be disgusted that it's horrible. Taken a sip of something assuming it's fine, only to be repulsed, this taste, you realize it's spoiled, have to spit it out. I broke my leg last August because I assumed my left foot was free of the pedal, and so I leaned to the left. Bad assumptions can get you in trouble. Sometimes the bad assumptions don't get exposed for a long time, maybe for a whole lifetime. Some people, and particularly in this culture, believe that, the relationship is the meaning of life. Now, they've never sat down and rationally thought through, what's life mean? What's it all about? And then deliberated and come to the considered conclusion that, yes, the most important thing in life is the girlfriend or the boyfriend, the wife or the husband, the soulmate, the love of my life. No, it's not the conclusion of considered deliberation. They just pick that assumption up from songs and movies. Maybe as a kid having adults ask them constantly, you have a boyfriend? Have a girlfriend? Maybe from watching their parents. Maybe in the air they breathe. Other people, of course, assume that money makes the world go around, and so they spend their life chasing dollars. Others assume that their feelings or their psyche is the definition of truth, of what they should do or what they should be. If I feel I am something, then I am what I feel I am. Both in the push to legitimize homosexuality and now transsexuality, people assume that what their psyche tells them about themselves, about either what they should do or about who they are, is more true, is more to be trusted than what objective biological facts show. A trans person assumes I am what I feel I am, not what biology says. They assume that psyche trumps reality. Or to probably put it more precisely, they assume that psyche is reality. What do you assume? Well, there's a crisis in the church right now because many people assume, they haven't thought about it, they haven't considered it, they just assume it, they've caught it from the air they breathe, that the church is just another customer service provider, like all the other things in life that center around them. It's like a restaurant, it's like a theater, It's like those other assumptions. People just absorbed it from the culture. And so they find it incredible that you suggest that life could be different. As Jonathan Swift said, it is useless to attempt to reason a man out of a thing he was never reasoned into. Now, for millennia, people assumed that the earth was the center of the universe. That even the sun revolved around the earth, which was stable. The earth, they assumed, was stable and still. After all, you walk out of your home in the morning, and the ground doesn't feel like it's moving. The sun is coming up in the east and going down in the west. It looks like it's moving. Not me. So you just assume that it's all revolving around us. Now, once you assume that, and there's no one to correct you, you just assume it, then it's shocking, even alarming, if someone tries to get you to even consider that maybe you're not the center of the universe. That maybe, hear me out, as outrageous as this might sound, maybe you and everything around you is spinning at about 1,000 miles per hour, as it is, and moving through space at about 67,000 miles per hour around a star. Now that's just incredible, isn't it? As in unbelievable. If you've assumed all your life that the universe revolves around you. Now here we see Paul confronting some bad but common assumptions. He's been showing that salvation does not depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy, that God loves some, like Jacob, and contrary to what we've been told to assume, he doesn't love others, at least not in the same way. He may be kind and generous to everyone, but he doesn't love everyone in the same way, not like Esau. And salvation depends on God having mercy, which he does at his will. Now that's just incredible. Like saying that we revolve around the sun. Common assumptions, wrong assumptions, have to be uprooted. So Paul does that here in 4 parts. First the potter, second the people, then the presumption, and finally the purpose. First the potter, beginning of verse 19. Paul answers the question that comes naturally to people who have assumed that the spiritual universe revolves around us. I thought God's acceptance of me depends on my choices. That I make a decision, and that starts the dominoes falling, either for my salvation or for my rejection. It depends on my choice. People just assume that God, like the sun, revolves around us. God reacts, they think, to whether I believe and obey or whether I reject and resist. My choices make God move. I act, he reacts. That's just a common, almost universal assumption of people today. And so Paul has just said in verse 18, he, that's God, has mercy on whom he wills, and he hardens whom he wills. Now the objection for the person assuming that we are the center of the spiritual universe is that that's incredible. He cannot believe that. That doesn't make sense. How can God harden someone like Pharaoh so that he disobeys God's command and then condemn Pharaoh for resisting him? Because you can't resist him because he's in control. Then how can he condemn me for doing what he made me do? Notice verse 19. Why does God still find fault? If our faults are under God's control, how can he judge us for them? Still common objections to this day. For who can resist his will? Pharaoh couldn't resist God, and yet God condemns Pharaoh for doing what God raised him up to do. We talked about some in the same idea, the same problem the past 2 weeks. Now first, it's not as though Pharaoh was going to let the Israelites go. It's not, Pharaoh was just right on the edge of letting those Israelites go, and then God reached down, intervened, and made him do something that he wouldn't have otherwise done. He made him hard-hearted. Pharaoh was by him. You just leave him to himself. He's soft-hearted. He was going to let everybody go. But no, God made him hard-hearted. No, that's not the case. God let him do what comes naturally to him. God put him in that place as king of Egypt so that he would do what he does. He would be who he is. And God gave him the command, let my people go. But he did not give him the mercy to soften his heart so that he would obey the command. But notice here in verse 20 that Paul doesn't try to rationally explain why it is right for God to condemn people for doing what God predestined them to do. You see, I just offered what I thought was a kind of rational explanation, try to justify what God did. Paul doesn't do that. Notice, Paul does not do what I just did. He doesn't offer the explanation that I just did that makes it seem more reasonable. Pharaoh was hard-hearted, and God hardened his heart by letting him be himself. Instead, what Paul does, and he's inspired, don't forget, what Paul does is go right to the assumption. That's where the problem is. The assumption that you think you can ask that question of God. The critic was talking back to God and saying, God cannot find fault with us for doing what God predestined that we would do. He doesn't have that right. It's wrong for him to do it. The moral universe revolves around us and our choices. Paul says, no, oh man. Who do you think you are? Who are you, oh man, to answer back to God? You think he's revolving around you. He is not. He's the potter. Paul doesn't try to explain God, explain predestination, doesn't try to sell it, make it more palatable, make it look attractive to rational people. He just asserts it and then goes for the assumption that protests against it in order to root that out. You don't make yourself. God does. He's the potter. You're the clay. So who do you think you are? Well, what is molded? You say to the molder, God, why have you made me like this? No. It's like if you made a figurine, whatever, you made a clay and you make a little figurine and you bake it and glaze it to make it look nice. Some kind of, whatever image it is you want to make it of, and a dancer or a shepherd, whatever it is, you make this figurine, put it on your mantle, and now it's ranting at you. It's demanding answers from you. Every time you pass by, that figurine starts trying to argue with you. Why did you make me a dancer, a shepherd, whatever? You'd probably just shrug your shoulder and say, well, it's because I felt like it. It's what I wanted to do. As John Piper said, for man to advise God about how he ought to act is as out of place as for a statue to advise a sculptor how to chisel. In verse 21, has the potter, God, in this analogy, no right over the clay, that is over people, all of humanity, to make out of the same lump all the material that he is making people with? One vessel, right? One kind of container, whatever it could be, a pot, a bowl, a vase, a jar, a cup, for honorable use. Honorable use, like a fine vase that you put in the center of a table, a centerpiece to show off. You can make one of those. Or another, he says, for dishonorable use, like a chamber pot. In those days, before indoor plumbing, people have chamber pots. A pot one uses to relieve oneself in instead of going out to the outhouse. The potter is God, and out of this same lump of humanity, he is making some containers to be centerpieces, to show off, to be fine china, ornate and beautiful. And then out of the same lump of humanity, he's making some to receive his wrath, his anger at sin, to be poured out on them. Now, potters do this all the time. They make pots for all kinds of purposes. Some to be beautiful decoration, centerpieces on a formal dining table or vases on a mantle to be honored. Some to be useful, like carrying water or wine. Some as chamber pots. Dishonorable. You probably hide it in a closet, I guess, when you're not using it. No one is going to say to the potter, but you can't make chamber pots. You can only make ornate vases. Now, if an ornate vase chooses of its own free will to be a chamber pot, well, that's up to it. But you have no right to make chamber pots. Now, the critic would talk back to me and say, but that's where your analogy doesn't work. Pots don't have free will. We do. We have free will. And we can choose to be ornate vase, or we can choose to be a chamber pot if we want. It's all up to us, up to our free will. But that's where your assumption is wrong. That's an assumption that we have free will. You assume we have free will, like you assume, naturally people assume the sun revolves around the earth. You make choices, sure. Yes, people do make choices. And you think you make your choices freely, unaffected by anything. But you're not aware of all the forces around you, your upbringing, your environment, all the forces in you, whatever it be, hormones, spiritual forces, everything that are guiding, even determining your choices. Just like we're not aware that we're all spinning on a globe and revolving around the sun right now. Free will is an assumption. Once gave a theology test in which I asked a question, list all the scriptures that teach free will. Do you know the answer? Nothing. You leave it blank. Some students didn't get that. There's this common assumption, we have free will. But the Lord Jesus said in John chapter 8 verse 34 that if you sin, and we all do, then you're a slave of sin. Paul used the same term in Romans 6, remember? Slave of sin. Slaves do not have free will. That's pretty much the definition of a slave. He has no free will. Psalm 51 says that we're conceived in sin. Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 9 says that our heart is desperately sick and beyond cure. Genesis chapter 6 verse 5 says that every inclination of our heart is only evil all the time. We don't have free will. Now sure, our will may be free of outward compulsion. God is not forcing us to commit sins that we don't choose. He's not like a puppet master making us do things that inwardly we're saying, no, please don't make me do that. But he makes us do it. No, like he didn't have to force Pharaoh to refuse to let the Israelites go, or he didn't have to force Esau to trade his birthright for a bowl of stew. He could just let them be themselves. They chose to sin because they were slaves of sin. They were free of outward compulsion, but not of inward corruption. Now here Paul is getting to that assumption that we think we have the right to tell God what to do because we think the spiritual universe revolves around us. Instead, in verse 22, what if, instead of God revolving around us and our desires, what if, that common assumption, what if instead we revolve around God's desires? Now the word desires there in verse 22 is the same word that was used in verse 16, remember? Where he says salvation does not depend on our desires. Now we assume it does. We assume I desired God, so I prayed and I got saved. That's how we assume things work. What really happened is God desired us, and his desire for us created our desire for him. We assume it does, but God has already blown our minds that it doesn't. What if God desires to show his wrath and to make known his power? What if that's his desire? The implication is that yes, he does desire that. Since he's the potter, he's going to show his wrath and his power by making vessels, these pots, these containers, of wrath. That is, they are objects made for the purpose of showing wrath on. Now, in preparing for the sermon, I was reading one of my normally favorite commentators. And he said, basically, this is his reasoning, his assumption, we know God does not make vessels of wrath. That is, people for the purpose of being wrathful on them. I thought, well, wait, we don't know that. He just kind of asserted it. You're assuming that, and then allowing your assumptions to overwhelm what Scripture is saying here. Here Paul does say that God, the potter, makes vessels of wrath, people to be wrathful on. Notice, even if he hasn't blown your mind already, that they are prepared. They're prepared. Literally fitted. Like a tailor fits your clothes, especially for you. He doesn't just give wrath off the rack. He gives tailor-made wrath. Fitted for destruction. The implied subject, that is the one who is doing the fitting for destruction, is God, the potter. And someone will react, well, that can't be. No potter makes pots just to be destroyed. What the commentator said. You don't make pots just to be destroyed. Well, actually we do. Now they make clay pigeons just for the purpose of being obliterated in skeet shooting. But that's beside the point here. The point here is to uproot that assumption that makes you react with, that can't be. The spiritual universe revolves around us. Paul here says, no, it doesn't. God is the potter, and he can make people for any purpose he chooses. He's the one whose will is free, not yours. Notice though in verse 22, the potter has endured with great patience those ranting figurines. They're ranting at him, and he's enduring. He's being very patient with them. These ranting figurines that he's made, they're insisting that he can't do to them whatever he wants to do to them. He's patiently enduring it for now. What if he's done this? He fitted some for destruction in order that, this is the purpose the potter is making vessels of wrath, and it wasn't just to destroy them, to make these people just for the pleasure of destroying them, but to make known the riches of his glory. Now, if you just stop there, you'd think that, well, God is simply demonstrating his glory in order to be glorified, which would be good, but he's doing it at the expense of people, which we could say, well, and he can do that. But that's not where it stops. What if God desires to show his wrath in order that God might make the riches of his glory, that is the resurrection, the new heavens and the new earth, the release from the bondage to decay, the glorious freedom of the children of God, make all that known on vessels of mercy. Okay, it's a complicated sentence there. You're noticing all the parts putting it together. Notice it's on the vessels of mercy. He's doing the fitting for destruction for the vessels of wrath in order to have mercy on the others. That's the goal here. The riches of God's glory, though, is also specifically noticed that is on them. It's not just to them. And hopefully them is us here. The glory is on us, not just to us. As though it's just about us learning how glorious God is. Somehow we just see God's glory and we're amazed by it, which is part of it. But it goes way beyond that. The glory is on us, meaning that we experience it. We receive it. We benefit from it. We're vessels, we're pots for glory to be poured into. And that's what he's making us for. And he made us for that beforehand. He pours glory into us. Notice at the end of verse 24, he, that is God. By the way, it's explicit this time. When he's preparing beforehand for glory, specifically stated God is doing it before. It was assumed, it's implied. But here is direct when it's about glory. God prepared the vessels of mercy beforehand. That is, before we had done anything good or bad, like Jacob above. So it's predestination. God prepared them, us, beforehand for the destination, glory. His glory is not just shown in his power of his wrath, his anger against sin, but his glory is shown in the outpouring of his mercy on his people. That's the final purpose. He's the potter, and he's making some centerpieces, some vessels for glory, to be trophies of grace on his mantle for eternity, displaying how merciful he is. Second, starting in verse 24, is the people. Who are the vessels of mercy? Who's the us? Verse 24, even us. We're the vessels of mercy. Well, who is this us? This we looked at 3 weeks ago at the end of chapter 8 and beginning of chapter 9. Remember who's it for? But at the beginning of this chapter, Paul was really focusing on who it is not us. It's not the Israelites by birth. Now, speaking of bad assumptions, they assumed that if they were from Israel, they were of Israel. But Paul says, remember in verse 6, not all who are from Israel are of Israel. Not everyone is born into the ethnic group as one of God's children. And here he completes the idea that he began chapter 9 with. Who is us? It's those whom God has called. In verse 24, even us, whom he has called. And he's called us not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles, from all kinds of people. What the Lord Jesus called in John chapter 10, the other sheep. I have other sheep who are not of this Jewish sheepfold. God is calling people from all ethnicities. Foreign missions is about getting to those people whom God is calling from other nations. Just crossing ethnic boundaries to get to new people. Paul then quotes Hosea's prophecy that originally appeared to be about, in Hosea appeared, you would kind of assume, a natural assumption, that it's about God restoring natural Israel. He quotes that and says that it is really fulfilled. The real purpose of that prophecy from Hosea is fulfilled by the church, by people from all kinds of nations who were not God's people. They were Gentiles. They're not God's people. And now they're becoming part of God's people, the church. Those people, like you and me, right, from all kinds of different nations, those barbarians up in Europe, those Africans, those Chinese, those people who had no ethnic connection, no claim that they're descended from Abraham, who couldn't claim to be born into God's chosen people, who were not my people, are now called by God to be his sons and daughters. Now they're God's children. Called Gentiles are God's children. That's the us, even us, whom he has called. Now, as for the natural people, the ethnic Israelites, Paul says that the prophecies from Isaiah chapter 10, chapter 1, apply to them. Though they were as numerous as the sand on the seashore, so literally fulfilling the promise to Abraham. Some people complain the Old Testament promises have got to be fulfilled literally. Paul is saying here, it was literally fulfilled. Okay? Abraham has many descendants as the sand on the seashore. But only a remnant, that is a small portion, will be saved. That's the Lord's sentence on them for their sin, for their unbelief. And he will carry it out quickly, which he has done. He's already done for his work concerned. He left them he left literal Israel, a few children as children of God, like Paul here. Otherwise they would have been wiped out, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. So God's people are one holy nation, called out by him, and even a few left over from national Israel. Third, the presumption in verse 30. The presumption explains why so few are left from this once large nation to whom and through whom God revealed himself. Why are there so few Israelites left among God's people? You read through the Old Testament, you think these people, this nation, surely it's going to be the bulk, it's going to be most of eventually God's people. But in the end, so few of them. Why? Well, because of their presumption. A presumption is an assumption. It's an idea taken as true, but rarely examined. Just kind of breathed in. Accepted without deliberation. The presumption here that kept so many Israelites out of the true Israel is that they can be, they thought, God's people. They can be accepted by God by law keeping, by religion, morality, by work. In verse 30, what did we say? If there's only a few natural Israelites left in the true Israel, only a remnant called by God to be his children, how is that right? How could that be? Then he says they have pursued the law to be right with God in verse 31. It's not as though they were trying now. It's not as though they're, by the New Testament times, by this time, it's not as though they were idolatrous. They were disobedient to the letter of the law. They were in the Old, like they were in the Old Testament. During, when Jerusalem was destroyed, Jeremiah was prophesying to them about all their idolatry and other sins, but they wouldn't listen to him. Now, here in the New Testament, they are pursuing how to be right with God. That's what righteousness means in verse 31. It's a right relationship with God. They are chasing after that. They're striving to be right with God. They're straining for it. And yet they don't reach it. And meanwhile, Gentiles, as people who no ethnic connection to God's people, to Abraham, who are not pursuing a right relationship with God, or aren't striving to keep God's law, these Gentiles, they got it. Why? Because of the Israelites' presumption. They assumed that a right relationship with God could be earned by religion, by law keeping. Notice verse 31. Why were they not getting righteousness? That's right standing with God. Why were they not getting it? Because they did not pursue it, that is right standing with God, by faith. They were pursuing it, but not by trusting God. They were trying to earn it. They presumed that it was by the labors of their hands that they could fulfill the law's demands. If it didn't seem to be working, they were keeping the law, it still seems like God is not pleased with them. Well, their advice was always the same. Try harder. Find something else to deny yourself. Invent a new law to obey. Maybe you're just getting too close to disobeying God's law, so build a hedge around it. If the law says don't eat a kid, a baby goat, boiled in its mother's milk, then somehow make that a prohibition against cheeseburgers. That's for real. For Christians, if you're legalistic, you take the scriptures against drunkenness to mean they can't ever have any alcohol. All because you assume that being right with God depends on your effort, your exertion, running. Why is there only a remnant left in the nation that God gave all these blessings to at the beginning of the chapter? You know, the glory, the covenants, the promises, the patriarchs, even physically God in human flesh. Why so few of them now are God's people? Because of their presumption. They approached righteousness, look at verse 32, as if it were. And when you say as if it were, you mean it's not, but someone presumes it is. And if you say about someone, he walks onto the court as if he were LeBron James, you mean not only is he not LeBron James, he's probably not even a very good basketball player. His presumption is totally wrong. Here they pursued a right relationship with God as if it were based on works. As if they could earn it. As if means they are assuming something that's not true. It tells you that it was never based on works, that you could never earn it. And so with that presumption, despite the fact they still presumed it was true, that it was based on works, and with that presumption, when God's Son came to them, said, have faith in me, build your life on my word, I'm the cornerstone, trust me, they stumbled over him. They were offended. They wanted to try harder at law keeping, not be ashamed of their failure, not trust and say, you must save, and you alone. Their presumption was that they could earn God's approval. They were ashamed of admitting that they could not, because they didn't understand the purpose of the law. Fourth, the purpose. At the beginning of chapter 10, he goes back to where he was. He's actually closing a loop here, where he started at the beginning of chapter 9. His longing that his people be saved. He's just showed us from Isaiah that only a remnant, as a small leftover portion will be, but still he hopes for more. His heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. He testifies in verse 2 that they have a zeal for God. Could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? Now many will think now, well, the zeal for God, surely that's proof they love God. They're right with God. At least in their own way, right? They have zeal for God. Their religion's working for them. They must have their truth, don't they? They're saved in their own way. They feel they are. And if what you feel is true is the definition of truth. Well, zeal for God is good though, right? In Romans 12, Paul will tell us, never flag in zeal. The Israelites had lots of zeal at this time. Around this time, about a decade or so earlier, Pontius Pilate brought emblems, standards, kind of like a flag, with images of Caesar into Jerusalem. And this greatly offended the Israelites as a violation of the second commandment. And so a large group of men came to Pilate, demanding, begging that he remove the images, but Pilate refused, saying that it would be an insult to Caesar for him to do that. And so the men prostrated on the ground around Pilate's palace, begging for the images to be removed. They protested like that for 5 days. Now finally Pilate had had enough, and he got his troops and had them surround the men with their swords drawn and threatened to kill them if they didn't disperse. And the men bared their neck and say they'd rather die, we'd rather die than transgress the law. Pilate was so astounded by their religious zeal, he backed down and removed the emblems. They were zealous, but it was a zeal without knowledge. They don't know the God they say they're zealous for. They assume that being right with God comes by law keeping. The purpose of the law, they think, is to strictly obey it, and so by obeying it to earn God's approval. They assume that you get right with God by religion. Maybe for us, we would say by baptism, by repeating a prayer, by claiming to believe things that don't make any change in your life, that don't produce a zeal for God, that don't make us zealous to know God and drive us to His Word. Really, that's just another way of doing what they're doing here, being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish our own. We establish our own by an easy believism. Establish our own in verse 3, right? Real righteousness of God, that is really being in a right relationship with God, will indeed produce zeal, like the Israelites had, that you'd be willing to bare your neck and die rather than offend your father, but it's a zeal that drives you to knowledge. Knowledge about how you become right with God. Drives you to His Word. So you know, not the labor of my hands can fulfill your law's demands. Could my zeal no respite know? Could my tears forever flow? All for sin could not atone. You must save, and you alone. But the critic speaks up one more time. If being right with God is not earned by law keeping, then what's the law for? Now, surely God gave us the law to climb to heaven, to earn points with God. No. Now, people assume the purpose of the law is to earn God's approval. That's a false assumption. Paul says in verse 4, you can't earn your own right standing with God by law keeping. That's not the purpose of the law. Verse 4 gives us the purpose of the law. Notice the word end there. At least in the ESV is translated as end, which means the purpose, the goal, the final destination that the law is driving us toward. And literally in Greek, translating that phrase, it says, for the purpose of the law is Christ for righteousness to all the believers. The purpose of the law is Christ for righteousness to all the believers. The purpose of the law is not to try harder. It's to bring you to Christ for being right with God. And the law is for all the believers, so as to make them aware of their sin, aware that the labors of their hands cannot fulfill the law's demands. As Luther said, I have this law to see therein that I have not been free from sin. And so we cry out, you must save, and you alone. The purpose of the law is to bring us to Christ, to make us right. We so naturally assume, just like we would assume that the sun's revolving around us, if someone who found out better hadn't told us, we naturally assume that God revolves around us, around our choices, around our law keeping, our religion, that we can move Him with enough work or enough tears, or if we raise the volume loud enough, or if we pay Him enough money. We're ashamed to admit we can't. That even our receiving mercy depends not on our will or work. But don't be ashamed. Uproot those self-centered, God-reducing assumptions, that tendency in you to be the ranting figurine. Believe in Him, the potter, and you will not be put to shame.